Once you believe that someone is interacting with a scammer, what are the warnings and interventions that are most effective to break that?
Hi everyone, welcome to the Feedzai podcast. Today I'm joined by Kate Griffin, who is the Director of the National Task Force on Fraud and Scams at the Aspen Institute. Did I get that right?
You sure did. Thanks so
That's
much.
a great welcome. First of all, I think what I'd love to do is just start with the Aspen Institute, because not everybody who's listening to this podcast will necessarily be familiar.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually love to tell this story. I think it's really quite interesting. So just after World War II, there were a group of corporate leaders in the United States who said these were some of the worst atrocities known to humankind. Don't we have a job to do as leaders in this society to ensure that that never happens again? The notion of asking of ourselves as leaders what our role is in creating a better society is the sort of underpinning of the Aspen Institute. We have done that now for 75 years, running programs that help with leadership development, distilling values. We do public programs. Some of your listeners might have heard of the Aspen Ideas Festival. And we have policy programs that work on different parts of making society better. I have colleagues who work on food and medicine and health and national security. And the financial security program where I work is focused on solving for the most common household financial challenges. So we do a lot of work in consumer finance.
From a fraud and scams perspective, the US market's somewhat unique. In a lot of the markets I go to and work in around the world and have been to recently, you've typically got some kind of governmental body. There's that sort of focus from a governmental point of view on this. In the US, it's always a little bit different. You've got, as you say, you've now got yourselves in here effectively joining the dots because, in the US, there are so many different rails that payments can move on. There's so much choice, and that's always the way the US has been built to give choice to the consumer. But that creates a challenge in terms of coordination. So how's the Aspen Institute,
Yeah.
filling that gap?
When we looked at the issue, it became clear that, first of all, the scam ecosystem extends far beyond financial services. If you think about the life cycle of a scam, you've got everything from sort of how the criminal makes first contact, whether that's via social media, other kinds of online platforms, fake websites, email phishing. So all of that kind of provider landscape through our telecommunications systems. And then, as you point out, a variety of pieces of the financial services ecosystem, whether that's your bank, the payment rail you use, you put it into a crypto wallet, et cetera. And what we discovered is that within each of those sectors, you had leaders passionately working to try to figure this out and what their role could be in preventing scams. And as we started to ask difficult questions about why we were failing to do that, it became clear that everyone was at the limits of what they could do alone. They were really looking for someone to facilitate greater coordination across those sectors, coordination with law enforcement and other parts of our government, to build out what is a coordinated national strategy to prevent fraud and scams. And so that's really the role we're playing, is to facilitate that process, to facilitate that dialogue. We have over 80 members of the task force that span private sector, public sector, and a number of really important consumer groups that are both helping us to better understand the victim story and doing victim recovery work.
How did you go about, getting 80 members in a relatively short space of time is quite impressive. How did you do that?
What's
That's
the
got to be a
magic?
story, yeah.
What's the magic? Well, a number of things that we've done. We know we want to get to the idea of this coordinated national strategy. And we know that it's more than just a piece of paper. Right. The process and the dialogue that you take to get there will surface new partnerships, new ways of working together. So the process is as important as the output, if you will.
hmm
We first, in onboarding everyone as members, really took a lay of the land of where people felt like the most pressing problems were to solve. And so we coordinated 4 sub-working groups on 4 of the most pressing problems just to get everyone started. And so that's phase 1, and we're just wrapping up phase 1 now. And so those 4 issue areas that we've been working on is first of all, metrics and measurement. in the United States, we don't have a single government entity in charge. There are a number of agencies that touch this. And we often say it's a problem that is part of each of their missions to solve for, and yet it is no one's number one priority.
People need to talk the same language, and metrics
Absolutely.
are critical because what counts as a fraud, what counts as a scam, how do you record that, how do you value that? Is it just the financial loss, is it the cost of managing the financial loss, is it the cost of both of those things, plus potentially any recompense that goes back to the victim,
Right.
and is it the cost of the law enforcement on top of that? There's all these different
It's all
pieces,
these
and it's
things, right?
when you get into this, it's getting that clear set of benchmark metrics that everybody can use to talk on the same level. It's critical. So it's great to
Yeah.
I love that you said that first, because it's
Yeah.
one of the things which I've seen so many times make this really hard.
It is really hard, yeah. So we're just we've got a draft metrics framework that we're working on finalizing, and it does everything from how do we measure the scale, what are the measurements we want to track to see trends over time, and then what is it that we want to hold ourselves accountable to fixing? What are some of the things that we want to see ourselves get better at? So sort of the efficiency or effectiveness metrics. So that's that body of work. The second area, which will probably come as no surprise to you, is around information sharing. So, what I should say is that the task force, we took a decision to really focus our efforts on prevention. How do we, this strategy must prevent criminals from getting into our systems, detect them when they're in, get them out as early as possible, do everything that we can to not let a consumer come in contact with a criminal, and then see what we do once that happens, but really trying to get as upstream as possible. And so the information sharing work really is about, particularly among the private sector entities, what is the information they are able to or need to share with one another to be able to detect and disrupt these criminals. And so that is everything from really rich dialogues about, here is the data I have, here is the data I think you have, and I would like, and then actually seeing where there are differences in that understanding, right?
And
Uh,
quite often there is,
there
because
are,
the
yeah,
number of different parts of this industry I've worked in, and everybody thinks, it's the old adage of the grass is always green. Everybody thinks the data that they have would solve my problem.
absolutely.
And when you flip to the other side of the fence and you look at it, you realize that, okay, maybe it's not as simple as that.
Absolutely, yeah, especially when these criminals are really hopping from system to system. So they'll be in contact with you on Facebook Marketplace, and it'll be 2 or 3 exchanges, and then, "Well, let's go over to this,
Messaging
messaging
app or whatever,
platform,"
yeah.
right? So the it's actually very small bits of data in each place, and so nobody has the full picture.
Well, it's calculated to make sure of that, because you
Mhm.
leave the minimum trace on their
Right,
side.
right,
Don't dwell too long in one place, because they know that they can become a target, because
right,
people are looking for them. But there's also, information sharing is critical. That's for
right.
sure.
Yes.
And I think the other one is educating organizations in terms of what they can do with the information they have, because I
Mhm.
think there are always new techniques, new approaches that another industry is using that you can bring to another industry. So sometimes
Mhm.
it's not just about the data you have, it's the methodology and approach you
Right.
have to that data. It's because sometimes we can get stuck with a certain view of a data set and go, well, this is the only thing you can do with it. And then you
Mhm.
talk to someone in another field and they go, oh no, we do this. And you're like, oh wow.
Oh, wow, right?
So I think that if you're providing that kind of connection as well, that's a big part of giving people new ideas of what they can do with the data they have,
Yeah,
because
I think that's
that's
a great point.
definitely helpful, because there's so many advances in that space at the moment. It's a really interesting area.
There are multiple, how do I say this? Multiple forums, multiple platforms, multiple places where information sharing is already happening. So one of the fundamental questions we're in the middle of asking with the group is, if we've laid out, here's the information we think we want to share and what we need that information sharing solution to do for us, here are all of the existing things that are already happening. Do we need something that is net new, or do we need to invest in what's already there? This is a problem that requires a networked solution. And that means us being all in on whatever that information sharing solution is. And so it's really some fundamental questions about, where do we think is the best investment of resources?
In my experience as well, a lot of this is also about the legal side of it and the confidence, because it's okay, well, I have consumer data,
Mhm.
I have, have responsibilities for data protection and those things. therefore it's like, you're overcoming internal inertia inside an organizations around, what should we share that data? Isn't that bad for us at a corporate level? I know that we know there's the odd adage, no competition in fraud and those things, but the reality is
It's not so clear legally.
it's not so clear in a lot of cases, and it's for the purposes of fraud and risk is sort of critical in getting people comfortable with that, and that's an
Right.
education issue as well, which I guess you
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
part of this whole process.
Well, I mean, I should say that all was just setting up about what's the data and what are the operational pieces. We have a whole separate track trying to look at what are the legal barriers and opportunities, I'll say, where they're already within different legal and regulatory frameworks because they're different sectors, and different rules apply to them when it comes to information sharing, privacy data, whether or not there's a safe harbor for fraud related information sharing. And so trying to understand amidst all of that whether we actually need to push for a legislative change, or regulatory clarity is another outcome that we need to get to.
No, it's a big part of it because it's often the regulation or the framework is there, but as you say, the regulations and frameworks are not necessarily consistent or easy to align between those different industries. Just as something as simple between telco and banking, what is required. You've got different regulatory standards there in terms of how they're held to account, and the risks and issues they have for data leaks. And then it's different for a corporate, and it's different for. So it's those things are no simple challenge
No,
to solve.
no, they're
But the
not.
intent is there, which is the important thing, and it's a case of saying, well, and again, if you can caveat that using existing regulatory frameworks which have exemptions for fraud and risk and those things, then sometimes it's just finding the right people to get through and go, yeah, okay, this makes sense.
That's right. Yeah. So that's two of the working groups. The third, the third is focused on actually how do we have better coordination and collaboration with law enforcement. And this, again, in the United States is a case where there are multiple law enforcement agencies that are involved, state and local, of course, but then even at the federal level. My staff told me we have 16 different federal law enforcement agencies at our tables. I've learned a lot about how this works in the United States recently. It wasn't an area I knew much about before. But it's been really actually very valuable. Again, passionate, committed leaders in the law enforcement community who want to solve for this, and for everyone to have better dialogue. It's been an interesting parallel to the information sharing conversation, because this is actually now, what data does the private sector have? One of the things that's really important, I think, to reframe the scam problem is that this isn't about how do you go after and prosecute one victim's story, but it is one criminal network attacking many, many, many victims. And so it is a data problem for law enforcement to be able to aggregate all of those cases to go after that big fish, if you will. And so how do we have better mechanisms to assist law enforcement with the data that they would need to be able to do that more effectively? And the fourth and final working group then is around consumer awareness, warning, and intervention. And so there's been some talk about sort of what are the big public awareness campaigns. There are a number of them being invested in all around the globe, including the United States, but a lot of really rich dialogue around, once you believe that someone is interacting with a scammer, what are the warnings and interventions that are most effective to break that? Often we talk about scamming as something that is essentially leveraging social engineering to make someone believe that the scammer is actually a real person who's working in your best interests. And so what are the types of things that can be put into place that help to break that spell and hopefully disrupt before the victim ever sends money?
When I first started out in this industry and I read about those kind of stories, my initial intent thing was, well, how could someone be so silly? How could you be so stupid to fall for that? Now that I've spoken to many victims, and some of them I know personally, I realized that in these cases, the victim isn't to blame.
No.
They've been socially engineered by very smart, very competent people who spend their entire lives doing this, who are professionals, and they're an amateur in that game. And quite often they're in a vulnerable position at that point in life. They've got a financial difficulty or whatever other situation they have in life. So they're more vulnerable psychologically to that happening to them. And the scammer can see that and takes advantage of it to maximize the gain that they're going to get.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested to understand, in your experience, what kinds of things are you seeing? Because I've sat in call centers and listened to people going through this, trying to deal with victims who are in this, some of the cases I heard were crypto scams. And when someone's fervently decided that they've been given amazing investment advice and this is the best chance they'll ever get in their life to get rich, and they want to send that money, it's really hard for someone in a banking call center to go, you know what, I'm not going to let you do this, because it becomes a very antagonistic situation. So what are you seeing? What tactics can help break that spell?
A few things. So, first of all, I actually, when we talk about consumer awareness or sort of what is the story that we need to be telling, I actually think the probably largest untold story here is who the criminals are. We are under attack by transnational organized crime rings
Yes.
trying to destroy our economies by eroding our personal wealth. I mean,
And consumer confidence and
and it's
confidence
right.
in your fellow person out there as well.
Right.
It's
So the thread from this person, as you say, a reaction many have, this person was silly or stupid and I'm never going to fall from that, to we're under attack. That's a totally different story to be telling and talking about, and the ground on which you stand there to say we're not going to let this happen
you're a
is
victim of
very
an
different.
attack rather
Right.
than you did something.
You are the victim of an attack, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I think it's really important. And a lot of the storytelling that we've been trying to do, both as we work to gain more traction and get people to really kind of think about the resources that are required to fight this, is to start to really tell that story. I think, second of all, there are some spaces where you're seeing sort of more quote unquote friction being put into the system. And I know anybody who's worked in technology hates friction. And it's funny because I've spent, as someone who's spent their career working on financial inclusion and financial health, like the speed of payments has been our rallying cry for a long
Hmm.
time. And now it's sort of like instant payments is instant fraud. But it's also, I think there are ways to, I think, really powerfully leverage technology, if we get the information sharing right, to detect potential criminality, to put almost easier speed bumps along the way.
And I
Just
think, yeah,
right,
I would have 10 years ago, I'd have said the same thing in terms of speed. It's all about
right.
speed. The faster we can go, the better, to get rid of all the friction. But I think the more I've worked in this space now, and you've got to a point where you can do things relatively instantly in a lot of cases, that doesn't actually inspire consumer confidence in a lot of cases. I want to know that the financial institution or the social media company or whoever it is looking out for their best interests. So I think my mindset has moved, and I see it in the industry as well, is towards you need the right amount of
Hmm.
speed bumps or friction or whatever you want
Right.
to call it in the way, which is, if I send $50, I want it to move now.
Hmm.
If I send $50,000, I want to feel really safe like that's moving, and I'm prepared to go through the
Right.
friction for that because it's a bigger deal, right?
Right.
So given all of that, what's the next stage? Where's the Aspen Institute? What's next for you?
Yeah. So as I said, we're just sort of wrapping up these sort of phase one working groups. We're looking towards, ultimately, what are the set of prevention mechanisms and things that we want to put out as part of that coordinated national strategy, and what are the kind of follow-on working groups that we need to do. There'll be things around the legal framework, around more in the area of communications and how we do website takedowns and things like that in our country. And the other thing that we're doing is really making sure that there's the political will to move forward on these recommendations, whether that is the investments that companies themselves want to make in the recommendations, and what we'll need in terms of our government investment in fighting scams. And so we're doing a lot of work in Washington to have those conversations over the next few months. So stay tuned. Hopefully, our plan is that this fall we'll have a big unveil of a national strategy, and the commitments that we want to see made towards making that a reality. And along the way, we are staying in close contact with fellow travelers on this path, who are working on national strategies, sort of rewriting the one here in the United Kingdom. Canada's working on something similar, following along as Australia continues to write its strategy, because it's also something where the more that we can have aligned principles across what these countries are doing, I think the easier it will be, particularly for global companies, to participate and be a part of the solution.
We'll be keeping a close eye for the report when it comes out and the national strategy. And maybe when it comes out, we'd love to follow up with you and get a discussion.
That'd be great.
Great. Kate, thank you for your time. It's
Thank
been a
you.
pleasure.
Yes.